Okay, we're going to start. Last time, we gave some background to prepare us. We spoke about some different pointers to prepare us for what we're going to talk about today and the next couple of times about washing dishes. We spoke about some of the details of not that were relevant and other things like that were relevant. We're in Tzadi Hey Sif Gimel Dal. And today we're going to be talking about using the same sink to wash milchig and fleishig dishes. So, of course, the simplest way to have a kosher kitchen is to have a separate sink, one for milchigs and one for fleishigs, which is wonderful if you can, and many people in fact do. And that's wonderful if you can do that. But there's also plenty of houses where there's just one kitchen sink. And the question is, can you use that same sink for washing milchig dishes and fleishig dishes in the same sink? Okay, so let's walk this through and see if we can understand what the question is or what the din will be. So at first you say is, no problem. That's not barnat. Let's say I wash a fleishig dish today. So tam was absorbed into the fleishig dish. Now the tam from the fleishig dish goes into the water that I wash it with. That's not barnat. So that water, you could even eat it with milk if you wanted to. So what could be the problem with the sink? And the same thing with the milk dishes. So nothing should happen in the sink, and everything should be perfect and without any problems. Okay, that's what you think at first. That's a simple look at it. But the reason why that's incorrect is because we know that one of the rules of not barnat is it only applies to absorbed tam, like the tam that's absorbed into the dish. But if you have residue food that's there, then not barnat doesn't work. And of course, that's exactly what happens when you wash your dishes. Dishes, you wash them because they're dirty, which means it's to say there's meat or cheese or whatever it is on the morning, meat or cheese. They came on time. There's meat or cheese. If you serve there, it's better for me. There's meat or cheese on the dishes, so you can't say not barnat because the dishes have this ben on it, so there's no not barnat for the Blios. Okay. So, but what about now the second stage? Okay, so we said there's no not barnat. There may not be not barnat for the Blia for the tam going into the sink, but it's not enough that our sink is straight for fleishigs. We need the tam to come out of the sink and come back into the other dishes. So when we say like that, when I wash fleishig dishes, let's say, then there's no more milk left in the sink. By that point, the milk and the cheese have been cleaned out. So even if the sink is milchigs or the sink is fleishigs, let's say it became milchigs, it is now milchigs or fleishigs, that tam can get back into my dish because it's not barnat the other way around. The tam that's absorbed in the sink, let's say the fleishig tam, that's one nut, and then it's back into the water is not barnat. So then the water is okay. That should be okay also. So the reason why that should not be correct is for a different reason. Why that would not be correct is because the same way flesh is absorbed in when I have meat in the sink, and we said that does not qualify, does not considered not barnat. So too milchig is also absorbed. That means is the blia that's in the sink from the milchig dish wash and the fleshig dish is no longer hector anymore. Now it's potentially basa b'chol in the sink. Once it's basa b'chol absorbed into the sink, now we don't have any coolers of not barnat. So we could say the time that went in fleshigs from the meat that was in the sink, and the time that went in from the milk that was in the sink is now together basa b'chol in the sink. Not barnat only works beheter. So to say that the time won't come out, because of not barnat, that's not going to work. Because not barnat only works beheter, and over here we're talking about this. Okay, so as we stand now, it would look like you would not be able to use the same sink for both milchig and fleishig dishes. Okay, that's what it would seem like. Okay, but if we're going to dig a little deeper, we'll find that maybe actually there is reasons to do it. And what we're going to talk about, just briefly, I'm not going to go into all the details, is the two tshuvas, a tshuva in Igros Moshe and in Minchas Yitzchak. The two tshuvas were written to the same person about a year apart from each other in the 1950s. The same person wrote both of them the same shayla. And they don't give the same answer, but their structure of their answer is the same, which is the structure of their answer is going to be here's a reason why you're allowed to you could be makel a certain way, but if you want to be more careful, you should be more makbid and do something else. Okay? The kuls and the chumras are not the same, but they both have the same idea, which is in din I can tell you reasons why it's mutter to do X, but at the same time you should be more careful and you should do Y. Okay, that's both of them like that. Okay, and as I've been saying, as you've heard from me saying already till now, the shaila has really two angles to it. This is not the way they talk about it. This has two angles to it, which is, does the sink become treif? And does the treif sink make a difference to my dishes? There's two halves of the question. We have to think about something happens to the sink, and if something happens to the sink, does that make a difference? Does that bother me to my dishes? Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all the details by any means. I'm just going to talk about some of the parts, and that's like this. We know it's a general rule. That in order for time to transfer, aside for heat, it depends what kind of a kli it's in, and the rule is kli rishon, time transfers completely. In a kli sheni, you should be worried about time transferring, but the ever nothing happens in the kli sheni. No time transfers in the kli sheni. And then something in between the kli rishon and kli sheni is Irui kli rishon. And in Irui kli rishon, we say that time transfers k'dei klipa, but not more than that. Okay, that's the structure sort of how time transfers in kalim. Now the difference. How do you know when something stops being an Irui kli rishon and starts becoming kli sheni? What's the line between Irui kli rishon and the kli sheni? So the answer is, the difference is when it's nifsak hakiluach, when the flow stops. Once the flow, the flow is considered Irui kli rishon. When the flow stops, that's kli sheni. Okay, so that's the dividing line between them. Okay, so now when we look at it, you say when I turn on my sink. So we say we'll assume, not everybody does, but we assume that the water coming out of the sink is Irui kli rishon. There's a pot, there's a hot water tank someplace in my house that makes hot water. That's a kli rishon. That's where the water gets cooked in. And the water's now pouring through, 20 feet of pipe out into my sink. And that's Irui kli rishon pouring out of the sink. Okay, that's Irui. But if it's Irui, then Irui kli rishon can only make a Blios k'dei klipa. K'dei klipa means is that if it hits a piece of meat, it's not going to transfer time into my sink because that's more than a k'dei klipa. It has to move the time from the meat into the sink. That's beyond what it could do. You'd say once the water passes the piece of meat, now it's a kli sheni because it was nifsak hakiluach. Okay, and therefore you'd say, hey, so no time could transfer to the sink because how could the time transfer? It's always nifsak hakiluach like that. But that's a very typical, but it's a little bit of a narrow way of looking at nifsak hakiluach. That's how most people would assume that's considered nifsak hakiluach. But Minchas he brings a shaila, which he says depends on a Ramah and a Shach, of whether maybe nifsak hakiluach is not as simple as we think. He says that maybe nifsak hakiluach means is as long as the water keeps on flowing, it's still considered Irui kli rishon. Which would mean is, and that's like literally the translation of nifsak hakiluach. If Irui until it stops flowing, that's Irui kli rishon. So it would mean is if the water comes out of my sink and it flows across the sink, we would think once it hits the sink, now it's a kli sheni. The one point of contact is Irui, and everything else is a kli sheni. He says no. The reason to think is that as long as it keeps on flowing from that water, that's still Irui kli rishon. It's only kli sheni when there's a break. It's not connected anymore to the original flow. But as long as it's still connected to the original flow, then that's considered Irui kli rishon. In which case, there's more room in my sink for time to transfer, because it's not just the one spot where the water hits on the floor. There's a whole sink worth of time that could transfer. That's how he thinks. And that's a reason to be more concerned that time would transfer. Now, Ramosha talks about the same Ramah and Shach, a possible steer in Ramahs, and what the Shach think. Ramosha has a more, if I can use the word, nuanced way of looking at this shaila. He thinks the Ramah and the Shach are arguing about different things. The Ramah holds the only time you say it's a spreading, that the Irui goes for as long as it spreads, is when the thing that's pouring has a status. I mean, if it's fleishigs, or it's milchigs, or it's treif. But in our case, it's not anything. The water that's flowing is parav. It's the thing that it hits that makes a difference. And in that case, then it's Irui like the old-fashioned way, like we think of, that Irui is until it hits the thing that's Irui, afterwards it's not. But the Ramah would only be machmir in cases where the thing that was pouring was Isser. And that's how he thinks the Ramah holds. He thinks the Shach holds. That you have to be machmir only in cases where it hits the Isser, like the meat and the sink at the same time. But not when it passes them. Once it passes the meat and the sink, as soon as it starts to move, that's not nifsak hakiluach. That is nifsak hakiluach. And Irui is, but if it hits the two things at the same time, then there is a transfer of time. And Ramosha wants to talk about that in the fourth part of the trivia he talks about. So maybe we should say you should be machmir for both of those together, which would be a very big chumrah. In the case of both of them would be making, maybe we should be machmir. And Ramosha, it comes out that it's not such a strong reason to be choishish that time transfers like that.
So I just want to make sure I understand the concept of
Go ahead.
So there's two ways I can understand it so far. One is, let's say I'm pouring, let's say from, the pot is pouring out, right? So up here, it already stopped. It stopped being poured, but the water is still flowing downwards.
Right.
That's one way to say it.
No. No one thinks that when it's the Irui stops when it leaves the top kli. The question is, when it hits the bottom kli, is it?
Even if it stops pouring, even if it's...
Oh, if it's not connected anymore.
Right.
Oh, no, yes. Yeah, I'm saying, yes, you're correct. That would be nifsaka
And
kula.
it's like, even though it's still falling down...
In the same
so to
flow,
speak,
correct.
But since it's no longer connected to the original path,
Right.
then that's nifsaka kula.
Correct.
That was...
No. So you're not saying, it's true what you're saying, but Dain Wright's saying it as a chumrah. You're saying it as a kula, that you could make it nifsaka kula by just pulling the pot back. He's saying is, if it hits the sink, and it flows on the sink, that's a chumrah, which he's saying is that it's considered Irui still, even though it's...
the fact that there's
it's still, you can connect it all the way back there.
But so would it work the other way also? Or?
Yeah, how it work the other way also, but he's not talking about that.
So and the other way to understand it is that it's nothing to do with whether it's still connected to the pot or not, but rather it has to do with if there has been any interruption.
No, does it hit something cold that cools it off? The reason why klisheni is worth is because the klisheni draws heat away from it. So as soon as it hits another kli,
it's a piece of meat. That would also be the same.
Yeah, that also draw away the top from it. It starts cooling, so now it loses its. So it has that 1 second of ability to transfer time.
Whatever, it's divergent.
As soon as it starts to move, then it's over. Then it's already in the klisheni. Right, correct. Okay, now the Minchas Yisrael gives another reason to be machmir. He says this whole tzad to say that Irui should be considered different than the kli rishon. That's only when in a normal case, a typical case of where the Irui kli rishon happens, you take a pot and you pour water out of it. Okay, that's a normal thing that you do with the Irui kli rishon. He says, but he brings rise that he thinks from Prim Gadol that if the kli rishon is still on the fire, then it's not considered Irui no matter what. It's considered kli rishon as long as the thing it's pouring from is still on the fire. Now that's a strange case. I don't know what the case is that it could be a normal buzz, but for us it's such a case because if I turn on my sink and the hot water tank is actually, the fire is on in it, which is not always, but if the fire is on right now, then I'm pouring from a kli rishon, and the kli rishon is still on the fire. Okay, which I don't know what the case would be is in everybody else's case, but again, in our sinks, we have this kind of a case where the kli rishon could still be on the fire and you're pouring from it. Usually you can't pour from something that's on the fire. It doesn't work like that.
Urn, let's say.
Like an urn, okay, maybe if you have an urn that's electric urn.
Yeah.
But 100 years ago they didn't have electric urn. So what kind of person is that? So you have an urn you have a pot of fire that has a spigot.
That they didn't have something like
maybe, okay, so something like that. Okay, but it's not a very typical case that you're pouring from a kli rishon, but the kli rishon could still be on the fire. That's pretty unusual to think of that. But our case, that's what he says. The sink that's what it is. The sink potentially is still our age, and maybe there are those who hold that's considered, that doesn't have the root Irui at all. It's still considered kli rishon. Yeah, as a portion to think it's not Irui kli rishon, it's kli rishon because it's still attached to the fire. Attached to the fire because the Dain Wright says is saying that Prim Gadol says such a tzad that's not considered Irui. It doesn't even we're talking about when does the Irui stop? He says not Irui at all. Maybe it's kli rishon at all. Okay. So of course the weaknesses of that I don't think everybody agrees with that shita b'chal. Actually, there are people the opposite who say a sink is so far away from the main kli rishon there's not even Irui anymore. It's 20. Remember, the hot water tank is not in your kitchen. It's who knows where it is. Okay, but the other thing is that you're making an assumption. You're saying maybe the fire was on when I wash my dishes. I don't know if I don't know how often the fire goes on in your hot water tank. Sometimes it goes on, sometimes it's not on. Okay. So now, so I can't go through all the different parts of Shua, but my reading of it is that there was good reason to think that there's time being absorbed into the sink. Remember I told you there's two parts of Shah that is time absorbed in, and if it's absorbed in, it doesn't get back into my dishes. There's good reason to think that time gets absorbed. It's not so clear that it can make basar b'chalav. There might be meat and milk time in there, but not that would make basar b'chalav. That's not as clear. And therefore there's potentials for not barnatz over here. And there's not so good reasons to think that time can get back out of the sink, back into my dishes. Like for example, Daimai says even if we're doing Irui, Irui is only vashak de klipa. So there's very little time absorbed into my sink. well, that time is going to be Batal B'Shishim in the water that's coming out to get back into the other sink, into the other dish. Okay, remember, the worst, if we think it's Irui, the worst is going to be Klipa. He says another thing. He says, what's the chances that the milchiks and the flesheks had Blios in the same spot within 24 hours of each other? Okay, so it's not so. If you're washing the dishes, the sink always pours in the same place, right? The faucet only hits certain spots. But I could wash some dishes on the left side, some on the right side. So I have to do both within 24 hours. That's also reasons to maybe not think. Okay, so the short version then of is that Dynamite says that you could say is the sink. Let's be choishish that the sink is treif. Not so realistic that tam could then get back into your dishes. He says, so what are we dealing with now? We have a treif sink. Okay, we have a treif sink, and we want to use it for in ways that tam doesn't transfer. He says, well, then that's really okay. But the Ramah says in Simon Kochafal, he says you're not supposed to use treif kalim even for cold. So he says, so he wants to say that should apply over here. Not so clear if that should apply over here because there's no way to use it in a way that would make a treif. But there's such a shita that says that such a Ramah who says you not only use treif kalim even for cold, you not use them at all. Even though by cold there's no tam could transfer. Tam can't transfer when it's cold. You shouldn't use like that. So he's saying it's not property. So you can use it there haroi, but on a regular basis.
The basin of the sink would be considered like
the sink is like a treif kli. So if the sink absorbs tam, so you could say maybe the tam can't get back out. But he says that's a not so great. He throws in. You should know it's also a reason to be made okay like that. Now, okay. So based on all of this that I told you and all the parts that I didn't tell you, Ramosha says it's really okay to wash milchig and fleshig dishes in the same sink. That's no problem. You're allowed to do that. He says, but minan then you're allowed to do that. He says, but you should be more careful and put a rack into the sink. One for milchig and one for fleshig. And you have one milchig, and that's good enough. Okay, so his ikar then he's saying is you really could use the same sink. And if you want to be more careful, he says put a rack down, put the dishes onto the rack. Don't put them right onto the floor of the sink. Put them on the rack. And Diane Wise, his kula is more strict than Ramosha's chumrah. Okay, he says is you have to have separate basins. You have to have a rack. The basin has to be on a rack, and you have to make sure the drain is always clear. The water doesn't collect on the bottom over there. That's his kula. That's what he says. That he thinks that's the ikar thing you're supposed to do. You're the most you can get away with. He says if you want to be extra careful, then before you wash dishes, before you switch sides, like from milchig to fleshig, you should run the hot water. Just run your hot water and pour it all over your sink. Pour it out of the sink. He says it's like a sort of a kashrus. It's not, of course, not a real kashrus, but it's something. He says that's what you should do. Sort of, maybe if it's not so clear, we hit every spot, you can do it well, but hey, it's better than nothing. It's worth something. Okay, so that again. So each one of them has what they think is ikra din, that it's not so bad, and then the chumrah to be more careful, person to be more careful.
I thought from Dan Rice's maskana was that it's not really, number one, it's probably not going to get trait, and even gets trait, it's not so precious about it.
Right. So part
is he being so machmir.
Part of it is because of chashas that maybe Tom really can't get back in, and part of it is because this thing that he brings from the Ramah that you're not supposed to use treif kalim. This part of it also is that. So by putting in a basin, I'm not using a treif kli.
And if I just put a rack, how am I using a treif?
So I don't remember how he talks about that. I don't remember that part. Okay. So now I have to just tell you that both of these Jews, they're both talking to the same guy, and the same shaila is talking about washing dishes. That's what we're talking about. Are you washing dishes, milchig and fleshig dishes in the same sink? That's fine. They're both what we're talking about. But there is another thing to consider, and that is people don't only use their sink to wash the dishes. They also pour food into their sinks. So like, if you have soup, you could pour soup you could pour hot soup into your sink also. You could pour, you make hot cocoa, you heat up milk, and you have too much of it, you pour it in the sink also. Okay, so all of a sudden, a lot of the cheshbonis having to do with Iruis and how much goes and where does it hit and this and that.
We're coming the water from the tap.
What did you say?
All the cheshbonis are coming
right, it's just water from a tap. Right. It's not so hot. It only hits certain spots. It's Iruis. It's not really. There's no meat or milk in that. But all of a sudden, as soon as I pour my chicken soup into the sink, my hot chicken soup in the sink, all of that. I don't know. Lots of that just went out the window. Okay, a lot of those cheshbonis, and even worse. Wait, let me just finish this a second. Even worse would be is if I do that with the wrong dishes in the sink. Think about what Moshe says. You could just do it with a rack in the sink. That means I have a rack in the sink and I have all the breakfast dishes are sitting there, and then I pour chicken soup onto them. Okay, so you're setting yourself for problems. Yes, yeah.
Two things. First of all, is that even if you're pouring the chicken soup, it's going to be a cliche.
It's going to be Irui.
You're from a cliche, though.
Why? No, chicken soup from the pot. I'm not talking from the bowl.
Why would you be pouring chicken soup from the pot into the sink?
You finished. We finished it.
We think whatever, is that leftover?
Right. Oh, we heat up milk to make hot cocoa, and everyone has as much as they want to. We're finished. And then we pour it out. What are we going to do with it? There's some more left in the pot.
Uh-huh.
Pour it out.
And then the second thing is that when Moshe was saying that you could use a rack and put the dishes on, I thought he was talking about just when you're washing the dishes.
That's true. That's what he's talking about. But what are you going to do with your breakfast dishes after you finish breakfast?
Well, if I have the same one sink and I have, then I wouldn't have a basin and then.
No, you're right. So he's avoiding the basic guy. So I'm not saying it's automatic, these kind of problems. I'm saying it's just that they're only the focus of specifically on, I'm going to wash dishes in the sink. I'm just saying there's other potential ways you can go wrong in your sink also. Okay. So in practice, it's my understanding that most Rabbanim will do something in between. Not as, if I could use as strict as Diane Weiss says, and as Linus Rav says. Most people tell them they should use a basin. They shouldn't just use a rack. There are plenty of people who use racks, who do like Rav said, they just use a rack. But I think most Rabbanim would tell people they should use a basin. Never put anything into the sink itself. Always put into a basin. And if it's possible, they shouldn't let water collect in the bottom, which also causes a potential problem. Collect in the sink part, underneath the basin. Okay? And you can pour out the water from the basin like that. Okay? Now, all that I just told you, everything is for milchiks and fleishiks, which is the common question is, can I use my sink from the same sink for milchiks and fleishiks? That's everything. But a lot of the coolers going around over here have to do with not barnat. Okay, that's why for milchiks and fleishiks, it's a perfect place to talk about that child. It doesn't help us anything for two other situations, and one is for treif. Like if you want to go if a caterer goes to a new venue and he wants to use their treif sink, okay, so treif doesn't allow for not barnat. Not barnat only works by heter. And the other case is for Pesach. Again, for Pesach, on Pesach, you can't say not barnat either. So there also, you couldn't say, well, all year round they use the same sink for milchiks and fleishiks. I could use the same sink now for chametz and Pesach also. Okay, that's not going to work. A lot of the stug l'hakol revolve around the dinim of not barnat, which again doesn't work for that. So those, if you want to use for treif, or for most people who want to use it for chametz, then they can meet the kashrus.